Hello, and welcome to the Digital Humanities Virtual Hour series at Arizona State University. It's been a while since we've been together, so it's really good to be back. For those that don't know me, I'm Liz Grumbach, the Manager of Digital Humanities and Research at the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics and the Program Lead for the Digital Humanities Initiative at the Institute for Humanities Research. First and most importantly, thank you to our co-sponsoring institutions for bringing us together today to learn and be in discussion. I'd urge you to explore the amazing work that both the Institute for Humanities Research and the Lincoln Center are doing at ASU. Before I introduce our speaker and we kick off our virtual hour, I have a few housekeeping things and some virtual hour guidelines. We're together in a Zoom webinar today, but the chat has been turned on. So please feel free to use chat to say hello, to hype our speaker today, and to connect with each other. These virtual hours are intended to foster discussion. And speaking of discussion, if you have a question for our speaker at any point during the presentation, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. We've reserved much time for Q&A with our speaker today. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and it will be posted online, and computer-generated captioning will be turned on for this event momentarily. If you have any issues activating it once it's been activated, please let me know in the chat and we'll troubleshoot. And finally, and most importantly, our digital humanities at ASU events have always been a feminist and an anti-racist space. And this applies to our virtual hour events as well. Harassment and discrimination are not tolerated here, but most importantly, our digital humanities community operates from a place of care. We support one another's work, safety, and livelihood, and that support is ever more important as we continue to deal with new and old challenges. And I think our digital humanities community has always shaped the programming for the year. So if you have a project or a topic or a reading that you'd like us to discuss, please let me know and we will make that happen. And now it is a pleasure and an honor to introduce Lindblad, who will be presenting on advocacy by design, reparative practices for digital archives. Lindblad is the Assistant Director of Innovation and Learning at MITH. She coordinates MITH's growing portfolio of courses and instructional programs and is a member of the African American History, Culture, and Digital Humanities team. That's AdHum. has an MA in American Studies from Michigan State University and an MS in Information Science from the School of Information, University of Michigan. Interested in digital humanities since graduate school, has worked at Michigan State University's Matrix, Virginia Tech Libraries, and the Scholars Lab at the University of Virginia. is broadly interested in the implicit and explicit effort that digital humanities can do for social, cultural, and environmental justice. Applying principles from feminist interface design, and her Scholars Lab colleague, Jeremy Boggs, explore how the process of feature development and public documentation shape the experience of users and render the theoretical underpinnings of digital work more accessible. Her recent publications include Praxis, a keyword in the MLA Commons Digital Pedagogy in the Humanities, as well as a chapter in Making Humanities Matter. And as a brief note, I have had the pleasure of being in community with for, I think, almost 10 years, maybe over 10 years, where she has been just a central figure in the digital and archival spaces that I've gravitated to in this profession. Only recently have I had the opportunity to call her a collaborator, but her work in the field has been influential, a force, and an inspiration for many years. So I am honored that she has made time to speak about her current research and projects with our ASU community. So I will hand over the mic to you.
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction, Liz. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So let me share my screen and start this. Okay. And again, if anyone has any questions or would like me to kind of linger on any aspect of the talk, please put it in the chat. I will try really hard to keep my eye on the chat, but if not, we'll cycle back to it during the Q&A. So again, it is an absolute pleasure to join the Arizona State University Digital Humanities Summer Virtual Hours. And I want to acknowledge and thank my collaborators. As you heard in the introduction, Jeremy Boggs, who's the head of research and development at the University of Virginia Scholars Lab, as well as Liz Grumbach and the amazing team of the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics here at Arizona State University. And I'm delighted to share some work in progress on advocacy by design and reparative archives as avenues for crafting a critical digital practice. Given a moment which can feel a bit apocalyptic with war, rampant racism, gun violence, political scandals, alongside environmental disasters like wildfires, heat waves, and global pandemics, questions of repair, of advocacy, of enchantment feel particularly fragile. Yet it is specifically in this moment which such speculations are most powerful. In her workshop on time, memory, and justice in marginalized communities, Rashida Phillips proposes oral futures is about speaking into existence what you want to have happen. This is a quote that I have carried with me, and if you've ever heard a talk from me, you probably have heard this because I find it so powerful. And particularly within this moment, this precipice of where geological and human time intersect in unprecedented fashion, what futures will our digital work speak into existence? Which practices carry forward our commitments? And what does it mean to make things in humane, empathetic ways? So my talk today explores advocacy by design, which is an avenue for reparative archives, a reparative practice. Speaking of digital archives specifically, but digital humanities work more broadly. Advocacy by design is a framework for critical engagement centered on advocacy, but one that encourages practitioners to be explicit in the issues they wish to advocate for, to articulate the goals they wish to achieve, and to establish a process that moves work forward towards those goals. So Steve Jackson writes, and this is the full quote, "Here then are two radically different forces and realities. On one hand, a fractal world, a centrifugal world, an always almost falling apart world. On the other, a world in constant process of fixing and reinvention, reconfiguring and reassembling into new combinations and new possibilities, a topic of both hope and concern. It is a world of pain and possibilities, creativity and destruction, innovation and the worst excesses of leftover habit and power," end quote. As one engaged with the digital or brand new to the digital, you may be familiar with the possibilities of digital work, which include, we're often hype, we're able to ask new questions, we're able to draw relationships between materials and subjects in innovative ways. The digital allows us to connect and to communicate more broadly our scholarship and be in community with others. Perhaps less familiar are questions of attention, of pace, of breaking, and of repair. As Bethany Novisky posed, what do we attend to at the end of the world? Or more optimistically, perhaps, within Jackson's broken world thinking, how do we design digital work to weather periods of transition, neglect, and decline from the very beginning, from that first idea of wouldn't it be cool if, all the way through to the final project? Our goal as we work within the digital is to do so in such a way that encourages reflection, encourages understanding and engagement with the materials that we're working with alongside notions of repair. These ideas of reflection, understanding, and engagement point towards both ourselves as well as any potential user or reader of our work. Repair similarly points towards practices of mending, so individual mending or repair, as well as identification and sort of approaches to repairing social breaks. And designing also repairable objects and repairable projects. In part, because humanities work has never been neutral, the emphasis on reflection and repair is to illuminate the movements between theory and practice, between form and content. And advocacy by design is a framework to support such efforts. Advocacy by design emerged initially as a way to deconstruct the inherent violence of archival work. Archives have been in the position to silence or obscure different voices, different records, abstracting communities' experiences and trying to render them universal. Also of inscribing and reinscribing hierarchies and assertions of power. we often say, why are archives so white? It's like overwhelmingly white. And so archives, along with digital work, have this sort of embedded assumption of neutrality, but clearly, once we start to look at them, once we start to poke them, they're not. And it's within these ideas around inherent violence within the construction of archives, within the construction of digital projects, that advocacy by design emerged. So Jeremy Boggs and I started working in 2014 when at UVA there was a disappearance and murder of an undergraduate student, Hannah Graham. That same year, an article came out from Rolling Stone entitled "After a Rape." In addition, as if that wasn't like traumatic enough for the entire university community, there was an assault of an African-American student leader, Martise Johnson, by 2 alcohol beverage control agents. And all of this led to the design of a project called Take Back the Archive and the development of advocacy by design. A major impetus was the sort of cry of, how could this happen here? And we had no idea. It exemplified a perennial cycle of forgetting and was extremely discordant with the long history of sexual and racial violence at UVA, but also universities across the country. So in response, Professor Lisa Goff and the Scholars Lab team organized a digital archive to document this history. And Jeremy and I felt, as we were beginning to build the infrastructure for this archive, that it must be feminist at the core, that feminist, anti-racist, and anti-violent principles had to be at the heart, and they had to be present at each stage of the project. So from the beginnings of collecting materials to describing and organizing those materials, to thinking through like, what are the ways in which we're going to talk about these materials through the metadata, what kind of schemas are going to be used, what sorts of vocabulary will be used to describe these topics, as well as to the collaborations we were building on campus. And then even further into thinking about the ways we would design the interface, like how people would engage with the collection through the computer, and how we might share the archive. So as we continue to work on the project called Take Back the Archive, we felt that this mode of working, this sets of concerns, could be extended to other projects. So advocacy by design articulates a shared understanding and practice that fronts questions of how people are represented in or are subjects of academic work. It asks questions of who reads and uses our work, as well as how those who wish to collaborate can contribute to the work. Advocacy by design offers a series of principles, which are not prescriptive. They are definitely not a checklist. Rather, it's a way of practicing that invites return and reflection upon the why and the how of digital work. Some principles are borrowed from Shawin Barzell's feminist HCI, taking stock and outlining an agenda for design, while others grew out of our experiences with Take Back the Archive. So these principles, which you can see on the left side of the screen, I think I have my left and right correct, such as like transparency and openness, include within them components or elements such as metadata, project management, open code, licensing, to better apply principles throughout the research inquiry. So and again, for example, the principles of transparency, which here means like thinking about modes of communicating, thinking about the infrastructure of the project, the ways in which we're influencing decision-making, and what kinds of things are actionable through the various elements. Some elements for transparency might include like a colophon or an acknowledgements page that indicates who's been on the team of that project, what kinds of contributions, and as people and teams change, that colophon could document those changes and contributors. Different collaborators, both within an institution or external to it. Other kinds of elements might include the metadata standards that we choose. If we commit our changes to a data log or a revision log that's public, if the code, if it's an infrastructure project or a building project within the digital humanities, is that code available, and where? Is a roadmap for the project public, and can people see it? So the different thinking through like transparency is like different kinds of ways of showcasing the kind of work that's being done on the project, as well as who's making decisions and how people might contact a team. So I wanted to show a couple of examples, and these are very brief. This is an example of Margot Dunlap and Anne Burdick's diagrammic design exercises, which are created to investigate Joanna Drucker's notion of a visual epistemology. So advocacy by design draws on the sort of critical making of design exercises to explore what Jeremy Boggs calls the adjacent possibilities. What is the question that we have, and then what are all the possibilities along each side of it? And it quickly surfaces assumptions, and it challenges us to think about why and how each of our assumptions, each of our thinking about the different kinds of materials that are involved, who's represented within those materials, how the relationships are drawn quite quickly. And for this example, Anne Burdick explains, and this is her quote, "This experience allows us to recognize a potential shortcoming of seemingly open-ended generative tools such as mind maps. They can be useful to, quote, think with, but the shape and relationships built into such software delimitate what is possible to imagine." So that's the end quote. And so one of the goals for thinking through design exercises not only surfaces what the relationships might be, who's represented, but what are sort of the limits of the technology that we might choose to use, that there are certain built-in assumptions and affordances of different tools that we want to make sure we're at least aware of. That doesn't mean that we can't choose to use those tools. That just means we want to think through, like, what do those tools do and how they shape us as we shape them. So this is another example of advocacy by design in action. This is not a project that I've worked on, but my Myth colleague, Raph Vigilante, has worked extensively on the Shelly Goblin archive, which collects manuscripts of the Romantic era of Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, and her father, who I can't remember because I'm not a romanticist, I'm sorry. But it's a really great project, and Raph moved it from a database-driven site into a static site, which means that it's really built on it's a little complicated, but it's built on very stable technologies of HTML, CSS, and some JavaScript. And that within the infrastructure of the project, all of the data that is part of the project can be downloaded and used offline. This project works with TEI, which is a text encoding initiative, which allows us to take a manuscript and annotate it as scholars. We can say, this line has been, has a line through it. There's been an annotation added. This is, this section of the text is in Mary Shelley's hand. This section of the text is in Percy Shelley's hand. So it allows us to leverage the ways in which we can describe different manuscripts and then render them online. So the main point here is that we're really thinking through at Myth, but specifically within this project, what are the affordances of a static site? Could you download a site onto a jump drive and then take it somewhere else and use it? And if that's the case, what else needs to be embedded within that, and how does that contribute to a more sustainable kind of web project? And this is my favorite slide, and it's a prototype of the Take Back the Archive website. This was one of the designs that we ultimately ended up not using, but I continue to return to it for a variety of reasons. One of them is that it sort of prototypes out the idea of a rich prospect browsing, which are the colored squares that you see kind of towards the bottom. The idea was that it would show every record within the collection. So everything that we would have would be represented by a little tile, and they're color coded to indicate that the material is mostly concerned with an advocacy or it came from an advocacy group. The blue indicate a policy, so the Board of Regents minutes, that kind of thing. And the green are newspaper articles, different reports, that kind of thing. So people can kind of move through pretty quickly to see just at a glance what kinds of materials are included in the archive, how much, is the archive weighted mostly to advocacy stuff and there's only a little bit of reporting, or is it, primarily balanced? What are the kinds of quick views of the data without having to go through, long pages of results that you can kind of see kind of quickly. So rich prospect browsing is exactly this idea of showcasing every item within a collection, whether that be photographs, documents, other kinds of data points, and putting all of that all at once on a page where someone could see everything. There's a lot of work with that's embedded with this, in the sense that in order to do that, if you show everything, what kind of pathways through the material do you offer for your users? Are there ways of quickly sorting or adjusting what you see so that it's not overwhelming, or that you can change the interface a little bit to where you might only see photographs rather than diary entries, that kind of thing. And we can come back in the Q&A to kind of talk more specifically about rich prospect browsing as a design feature. But in this case, I wanted to kind of showcase that the idea was to kind of begin to showcase everything, as well as to hint at, with the timeline at the very top, that different stories were large in a particular moment of time, faded from attention, and then re-emerge in later times based on the topic of discussion. So again, this was from the Take Back the Archive project. So these materials in the circles, they grow in size with the amount of material based on the reporting of a particular act of racial or sexual violence at the university. And the threads above it are kind of indicating that even though the sort of first materials date back to the 1850s, that story reemerges periodically all the way into the early 2000s. Okay. So in this example, their ideas of, or the principles that are kind of being worked with, are notions of transparency and polyvocalism, meaning that there are multiple ways to tell a particular story, that there are multiple views on a story that is being represented within the archive, and that our interface choices wanted to get us closer to showcasing that there was not just one way through. But less on the surface are issues of openness. And so openness, actually, let me go back to this slide a little bit. So openness denotes the sense of working in public or not. And I want to underscore the or not. So drawing on the wisdom of Black studies, some conversations, some materials, some projects offer shared experience, which are important for a broad discussion and invite multiple people within to that discourse. While other conversations truly require an enclave, that they're private. So having some of these discussions might expose participants to increased surveillance or negative consequences. So there are choices with openness that we want to really think about, not only what are the topics being discussed, but who, by discussing them publicly, are at further risk. And when are we willing to take those risks and step up and be the face of the discourse? And face of the discourse meaning like the website or the project, not necessarily an individual person. And so to reemphasize that there are some discussions that really do require privacy, and not all digital projects need to be widely public, or not every aspect of a digital project needs to be widely public. I think a lot about Kim Christensen, who asks for Indigenous cultural heritage materials. Her article is really great. It's, does all information need to be free? And the question is, for Indigenous materials, there are certain objects, certain things that were collected against a tribal's community's will, that were then displayed to a broad public, when those items might only be specific for people who have been initialized into a particular level or status within a tribe. So when we think about what kinds of things our collections begin to show, we also want to think about what kinds of things do we need to hold back and limit. One project that I worked on as a graduate student at Matrix at Michigan State was the Overcoming Apartheid project. And within that project, we were collecting the oral histories and the stories of anti-apartheid activists who had been very instrumental in the fall of apartheid. And one of the the aspects of that project were that many of the oral histories have been embargoed. Some of them are still not available because of the potential repercussions to activist families. So the notion was that these stories need to be preserved, they need to be collected, but they're not really ready for a broad dissemination at this point. And so thinking through like how we grapple with these questions of openness and what information should be shared, to whom and at what times, we might also think about different ways that we can share information about a project that does not expose others to surveillance. So thinking about blog posts or sharing or thinking at various stages at conferences or symposia, that kind of thing. We really want to think through when there is a decision not to share something, are there cues that we might give to potential users of our projects that say, you know, some things are coming, or you have to be a particular type of researcher to access them or not. And ways of gathering feedback are all part of this notion of openness and can be enacted within both the sort of workflows and plans of the digital project, but also through the interface. So I want to kind of wrap up my thinking around openness with some ideas from Moya Bailey and Danae Greger, who have both suggested that documentation is an ongoing process, and it's a kind of version control level of documenting the idea of project building, so that there might be modes and times where we work very openly and in public, and modes and times where we really work privately, but then later share documentation that helps better expose what the thinking in the project was. And I wanted to briefly touch on the principle of polyvocalism on this slide, which can be realized through elements such as integrated in multiple taxonomies. So for this project specifically, for Take Back the Archive, we ended up creating two different taxonomies. The Library of Congress has a vocabulary to describe records, and they're called subject terms. And for incidences of sexual violence, often that term from the Library of Congress is one of victim. The community at UVA, particularly from the Women's Center, most of the time rejected that term and ended up wanting to surface and sort of front the term survivor. So when you're searching through the collection of Take Back the Archive, both of those taxonomies, both of those subject terms are available. And so you can find things in a variety of ways. And another notion of polyvocalism, which is not on this slide, but is something that I think is a really interesting way of engaging with users, is allowing or sort of enabling public annotation. There are tools that you can embed in your browser called Hypothesis that allows you to annotate privately or publicly any web page. And so building in tools that kind of invite ways of users being able to like grapple with or annotate different kinds of materials within the collection offer another way to think through that there are thoughtful representations and invitations of the lives lived within archival materials, and whether those materials have been contributed or recovered or imagined. It's a way of kind of opening up a collection that there's not a single narrative, that narratives can loop back on themselves. And as humanists, I think we're all very comfortable with that kind of messy sense of a nonlinear narrative, but computers really don't like that. And so we need to think really critically about how to build in spaces for ambiguity and for multiple voices within our project workflows and our interfaces. And sometimes these elements can be enacted outside of the technical, such as like a webinar or a workshop, mentoring moments or teaching moments. So some of these elements can be enacted in person or virtually, and some can be enacted technically, and most move between. But all the principles and the elements, whether they're technical for the interface or interpersonal, include an engagement with design. And so I wanted to spend just a few minutes thinking through how I'm thinking about design. And I lean quite a bit on DeSalvo's definition, which is, quote, a deliberate and directed approach to the invention and making of things. to shape the environment of users, readers, consumers through the manipulation of materials and experiences, end quote. Ignacio Ferris and Alex Wilkie offer a definition of design, which include my absolute favorite, which is the creating knowledge about not yet existing things. But they further nuance design as a form-giving process or a stabilizing of new forms and artifacts. And both DeSalvo and Ferris and Wilkie, or all of them, really think through an idea of design modeling attachments to future users and consumers. So we're kind of beginning to imagine how people might use something and design for that end use. I lean quite a bit on Frank Chimero, whose quote you can see on the slide, and I'll come back to this and read it in just a moment. But Chimero suggests design is imagining a future, a practice to close the gap between what we have and what we desire. Chimero reminds us design is a practice of making for others, gesturing at the above. And he argues the relationship between the form, meaning the how, and the purpose, the why. These two are linked. Design, much like the digital, hold potential for inscribing biases as well as repair. Both design and digital work carry assumptions about potential users and uses of created materials. And as Chimero points out, it is easier to ask, how do I paint this tree, rather than to answer, why does this painting need a tree in it? Or in the case of digital humanities, it's much easier and much more exciting to say, how do I build a digital project? And it's much more complicated to answer, why does this digital project need to exist? So therefore, advocacy by design begins with the defining of the why. It defines the why of a particular research area. And this why then frames which principles should be fronted and enables us to identify which hows, or the elements, are critical and can be enacted. Further defining the why clarifies the objectives of our work. And I think this is really important because it's something that we can return to when the project tasks pile up. You know, when you're in the weeds of designing your metadata schema, to kind of come back up and go, oh yeah, this is why I'm doing it this way. This is why this work is important. And so to read the quote that from Frank Chimero, we dance together backwards into the future, giving influence and taking it, forming and being formed. This is dance of eternity, the shape of design, which I love. This is something that I have kind of taped to my desk. Okay. To illustrate how the principles and elements of advocacy by design form a framework for digital projects, I wanted to share some in-process work on reparative archives, which is done in collaboration with the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics. Archives and archival practices are not neutral, as I mentioned before. Archives exist not only to explain or contextualize the past, but also to signal towards and shape futures. Archives call to the fore the processes of preservation, memory, and access. Attending to these processes raises important questions of who decides what is significant to carry forward and how, in whose memory is the past best preserved. And as anthropologist Britt Stoley asks, how do we, and who counts as we, determine the ethical framework through which to focus our efforts of preservation and future shaping? As I mentioned before, there is an inherent violence in archival work. Through silencing and obscuring of people and sources, of creating and sustaining hierarchies through collection practices that value some voices and experiences over others, through naming practices, controlled vocabularies and descriptions, which can cause harm, as well as a hiding or a devaluing of the actual labor involved to create these archives, to do this work. As Jackie Wernemont observes for digital archives, quote, if we cannot see the ethical stakes and power relationships in digital archives, we are going to do violence, end quote. In response, scholars such as Ricky Punzalan, TK Sangwan, and Michelle Caswell have argued for reflection and action on traditional archival practices, modes to illuminate past damage, to build less harmful alternatives, and to begin the acts of repair within archival description. Reparative archival practices strive to involve the original creators or their immediate communities in the choices of which materials are accessible and to whom, and how those materials are described. And I want to take a moment to read the quote, which frames a lot of my thinking on reparative archives, but I don't actually include the quote in my written words. So, the true contribution of archival studies to critical theory is not just to provide a practical application that turns theory into praxis, in which we, quote, apply feminist theory or queer theory or critical race theory to archives, but rather the real contribution is one which we use archival studies to disrupt the ontological and epistemological assumptions of the humanities. So there is a two-way kind of conversation happening. Humanities scholars are really influencing kind of the shape of collections, how we think about the relationships within the collections, and archivists are coming back and saying, we really need to think through how we're talking about these things, how we're naming them, how we're organizing them, how we're describing them. And the stakes, which is a bit of a sidebar, so maybe we can go into this with the Q&A, but the stakes are, as Hope Olson has made, there's an immense power to name something. If you name something within an archive, that's how you then find it later. So while it seems to be kind of like not a very valuable position, there's an enormous amount of power in being able to call something and name it. Which then organizes it within the records and then allows future scholars, not just in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, but we're thinking archival time. So like 50 years, 100 years, 300 years to be able to find it. So the question becomes, how does all of this come together in a concrete digital humanities practice? How do we enact abstract principles such as repair or polyvocalism or a critical transparency within a digital workflow? To illustrate, I would like to share the nascent work Liz Grumbach and I have been doing on the Reparative Digital Archive, which is an initiative growing out of the Lincoln Center's Humane Technology Design Studios. The design studios enact a collaborative, process-explicit model for humanists to bring their perspectives into conversation with those from other disciplines and other professions. Focused on surfacing experience rather than job title or expertise, the design studios facilitate speaking across communities, building bridges beyond academia on issues of the structures and pace of work in a pandemic-shaped world. The processes to imagine and design technologies which would adapt to the human experience in all of our myriad modes of fitting and misfitting, and the techniques of highlighting interdependencies, spaces of past harm, and methods for mending. From these studios, a range of materials emerge from personal stories, small intimate snapshots of joy, anger, grief, and healing, as well as documents that capture the developing model and workflows of the design studios themselves. So the idea for a reparative archive is to both house these records and to offer tools for repair and mending, meaning both the archive and any tools will be iterative, action-oriented, and supportive of collaborative inquiry. The why, to return to Chimero, is to open the process and practice of centering humane experiences within the technology, to illuminate the varied ways we carry forward moments of joy, of intimacy, frustration, and connection within a breaking world. The why, or for me, what does it mean to make things in a humane and empathetic way, guide the selection of the advocacy by design principles for the technical work on the archive. And so for the technical work of the Reparative Digital Archive, a few of these principles include simplicity. And here we're thinking about, are the technical and design documentation available to those without extensive digital experience? Can someone come to the technical documents of the Reparative Archive and understand them? Can I explain them to my grandfather? Will he get it? Or be able to imagine building it himself? Are they sustainable? How well will the technical infrastructure of the archive and any accompanying tools weather periods of change? And how easy will it be for updates or other maintenance tasks, not just for this project team, but any future project team? This is an acknowledgement that people move, things change. And so how do we build in some sustainability, both in the technical, but also in the sort of interpersonal? We're thinking quite a bit about interoperability and how well will data move from the archive to other sites? Can the technologies supporting the archive be modular so that they might be adapted or reused in pieces, not necessarily all at once? And there's a great deal of emphasis on speculation. So what are the pieces within the technological infrastructure which invite speculation that support interaction or play or introspection? The elements are focused on the mechanics of enacting the how, meaning to ensure the archive is collaborative and accessible. The principles of sustainability and interoperability emerge as significant. To reach these principles, we're working within a minimal computing framework, which somewhat simply, and I think it obscures a little bit as we sort of like share it, but minimal computing relies on a very stable technology of HTML, of CSS, and JavaScript, and organizes documents within a folder or directory structure rather than relying on a database. And further, we're working to adapt an existing framework. So the University of Idaho Libraries has built an incredible framework called Collection Builder, which is a minimal computing framework. They include templates and other things, and it's readily adaptable. So Liz and I are taking that as our base. We're doing quite a bit of customization and adapting it to fit the needs of the reparative archive, but we are doing this not to, in a sense, not because it's easy, but because one, it's a brilliant tool, and that our contributions can be offered back to a community that is maintaining existing documentation. And so our contributions might help expand that documentation in some way and support a growing community around static sites. So once our instance has been adapted and tested and the first drafts of the documentation have been created, we will share the code, documentation, and workflows through GitHub, as well as the Reparative Archives website. Elements such as open code, open workflows, and minimal computing help enact our commitments to sustainability and interoperability. All of the data within the archive will be available for download, which invites others to engage with the primary materials of the archive, perhaps in ways that we, meaning the project team, have not yet imagined. Open workflows are even more important than open data or open access, which I think is quite a controversial statement, but I'm going to stick with it, in part because workflows give scope to protocols. They illuminate tools and practices, and they document the rationales of a project. By sharing the workflows, we can reuse and expand them. More importantly, we can return to them and update or fix them based on feedback. Open workflows give shape to not only what was decided, which path was taken, but why those choices were the best options, given our awareness and reflection of our own biases, our ethics, and policies at the time. As Sophia Noble writes, when we talk about these kinds of racist experiences and pointers that happen in technical systems, we also hear in the public discourse these things talked about again as anomalies, as glitches, rather than helping us understand and unveil the ways that programmers are people who write code, and that code is a language, and all languages are value-laden, including binary code languages. Chris Borg and Beth Sadler further, kind of more bluntly, write, when software is created in environments hostile against women, people of color, and other underrepresented groups, many kinds of inequity result. Digital projects are spaces to disrupt this discourse, to resist the notion of racism by accident, and instead we iterate and understand who is building the technical and interactive elements of our project. How are the potential users invited to provide feedback, and at what stage of the project? How does any software interact with the broader software ecology? Embedding advocacy by design principles and elements encourage us to think through and position our work as a resetting of priorities, an enactment of an ethic of care, of imagining infrastructures that resist social misery. Chris Borg and Beth Sadler observe, quote, building collections and developing the tools to access them are inherently political acts. We are creating the future library, the tools and collections that will be used to create new knowledge. The means of production for archives of humanities are up for grabs, and within our reach is the possibility of new production methods that resist the recreation of existing patterns of exclusion and marginalization. However, this will only be possible if we approach this work conscientiously and with an understanding of the impact of our decisions, end quote. Advocacy by design helps break the larger aspirations into workable pieces that are realizable at individual, team, department, or unit levels. It's an applied, practical approach of framing work, of framing interactions. And this is essentially shaping the work that we're doing and offering it up as an invitation to think together about how these principles apply to specific elements, specific items within a workflow or within a technical project, from the ideation of that project to the deployment of that project. And we strive to resist a rigid agenda setting, but rather keeping an attention on the interplay between the specific local work and possible accumulative, quote, end of pipeline outcomes. Repair, as Saida Hartman suggests, is acts of imagination. Hartman explores the uses and limits of a critical fabulation as a reaction to violence of the archive, in which certain lives, histories, memories are systematically excluded from the archive as an operation of power. In brief, critical fabulation is a creative method for reimagining histories that you cannot find and to re-embody these marginalized accounts or subjugated knowledge through acts of imagination. Abeyant records, longed for but never created, or recovered records, which might not have been collected but are held perhaps in stories or textiles or trust by a specific community, can begin to visibly mend the broader assertions of value and the accompanying push of devalue. At the heart of the Lincoln Center's digital reparative archives is this engagement with speculation and humane technology to collect and share the varied strategies used to collectively speak into existence what we hope to have happen, how we wish to say, this was us as we were, and where we hope to grow. In essence, how might we mend with words, images, color, shapes, and movement? How might we engage description as an act of contextualization, of calling into being not only what is, but also what we desire? Repair does not mean rejecting newness or innovation. Rather, it is a call to lean into the creativity and skills to reforge, remake, redesign what we use, what we create, and what we leave as traces of legacy. Reparative archives for me are speculative archives, assertions of what we wish to be as humans, as beings entangled in interconnected worlds. The records within the digital reparative archive show how we begin to remember and how we can lay to rest things we need to put down, not to forget per se, but to no longer carry. The advocacy by design principles and elements help realize, as China Miéville and Rosie Warren suggest, an armed hope, a hope with teeth, to resist romanticizing pasts or futures, but rather to dig into the present with its myriad daily losses and moments of sweetness, intimacy, and connection. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, I think.
I'll come back on and say thank you so much, Purdom. I have just like riffs of notes, and I can't wait to have further discussion with you. We have about 7 minutes left for Q&A. For anyone that's here, if you'd like to pop comments or questions into either chat or the Q&A, that sounds fantastic. But while that's happening, I have so many questions for you, Purdom, but I think you prompted this, so I'm going to start here. With what are the stakes, again, to return to that. So for all our work in digital archives, digital project development, also just in digital humanities writ large, or anybody that works in technology studies, what are the stakes? And I'll point to, I remember sometime maybe in like 2011, there was a European Commission, and I don't know if you remember this, that basically said, if we don't digitize and accurately describe what we have, and put it on the internet so that people can find it, then we will be heading into a digital dark age. Mm-hmm. And that's a quote that I remember popped around a lot, right? Is that the right quote? That sounds very doom and gloom. Is that what the stake is, or is there something else?
This is such a great question, and I would love for others to weigh in the chat. So I think there's a couple of things. Like I remember, like, because I was in an archives program at the time, and so this notion of a digital dark age just like rippled through my cohort and really forced us to think quite a bit about what is the mission of archives, particularly archives that are like primarily of born digital materials. And it was within and I don't want to say immediately that time, but within that bracket of time where like digital dark age was kind of like present within sort of popular discourse within the digital humanities, where there had been a great deal of funding in the late 90s for digital humanities projects, all of which were amazing projects, incredible. I worked on several of them, but they were each bespoke, each custom built, each had a different kind of content management system. So like, how did different projects organize the materials? All of them are different, and very few of them are currently available. And so there's a grappling with a couple of things within this notion, right? Like the stakes of how do we move forward are very fragile digital things. Paper, wildly, is so much more sturdy in the long run. Like as an archivist, like I'd much rather have paper. It can weather a flood, it can weather a lot of things. You know, a hard drive, it's tough, right? These things are less fragile. A friend of mine calls it the Best Buy test. If like the thing that you're making is available through Best Buy or Amazon, right? You probably have a good like 3 to 5 years of it working. If it's on sale, you know, on the clearance rack at Best Buy or Amazon, you should start thinking about moving that thing forward into some other format. Which is why I think there was a big movement towards minimal computing, to like really think through like what are the most stable technologies that we have. And that ends up being deceptively simple in terms of like HTML, CSS. So HTML will help you structure a website, CSS will help you make it pretty, and some JavaScript that will give you some interactivity for that website. But literally you can put it on a jump drive, which, as I just mentioned, is less stable, but you know, possible. So there are, this is a bit long-winded, sorry. So that there are technical stakes of like, how do we preserve digital things and make them available? There's some incredible work by Stephanie Sapienza at Myth around sustainability plans. Like Myth, the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities is the full title of Myth. It's at the University of Maryland. And we had a huge number of these smaller bespoke custom projects, all of which were on different systems, had different requirements for being available online. And Stephanie spearheaded a team to move all of that into a static site so that they lost some of the features, but they're able to be moved forward 20, 30, 40 years from now. So there's technical stakes, but then there are ethical stakes. And I go back to Hope Olson's Power to Name quite a bit, you know, as humanists engaged with not only analyzing, thinking through what our cultural record is and what it means, we're also pointing to the things that are important to collect and to preserve, right? So like our work helps archivists identify what's valuable. And if we're not clear in our biases, they're cultural, you know, they're unintentional. We're dipped in it, we're swimming through them, right? Inevitably, the things that we find important are culturally described, and those things change. And so for digital archivists, digital humanities folks, we're kind of pointing a light into what's important and in what form do those records emerge. And sometimes they're in documents, sometimes they're in diaries, but sometimes they're in quilts or stories or myths, right? And so I think that the stakes are twofold. There's like a technical stake, which I think you can't disambiguate from the ethical stakes. As we name things, as we describe things, as we put them into technical forms, we're making judgments. And one thing that advocacy by design strives to help us do is to not wear a hair shirt for that, but to best document where we are right now so that sometime in the future we return to it or someone else returns to it and we're able to kind of see what our best thinking was at that particular time. Yeah.
Purdom, thank you. That was I was more than I expected, and I feel changed by it. Thank you. We have a question, and I think this is the one that we'll have time for, and then we'll have to wrap today, from Rachel Fernandez, who thanks you for your very thoughtful presentation. Purdom, you mentioned within Advocacy by Design the idea of open source, open code, everything downloadable. How have you dealt with, and how do you recommend handling material that is sensitive or should only be available for groups of people? This material needs to be preserved and is valuable, but the items or the knowledge around it is restricted. And I will just say that this kind of connects up to your rich prospect browsing example. And I'm not sure if you wanted to talk about that a little bit more too.
Yeah, I'll try to be really brief because I'm aware of the time, and I realize that I always strive to be shorter, but I'm long-winded, so it's fine. But this is a great question. And actually the person that I think who does the best thinking around this is Kim Christian, in part because she has worked so extensively with Indigenous cultural heritage, and the idea that there are just some things that are really not meant for the public. And that, I think that stance is really okay. So if you have material that is sensitive, and you're doing a digital project on your own, I would highly recommend immediately talking to whatever institutional archivist or librarian is available to you. And if there's somebody not available at your institution, reach out, and I'll help kind of like navigate to someone who can help, because there's a twofold kind of question, right? You might want to pull out the things that are shareable. Like if you anonymize material and kind of pulled out the themes that were most relevant for that project and share those, and that could be downloaded or experimented in some way. But the actual materials are embargoed, meaning held back for a period of time or forever. There are a couple of projects that are really great, but you can only access them at the site of the project, that they're not on the web. And so these are choices that are extremely complicated and they feel really thorny. But I think if you can kind of push away all of the messaging for make everything open and look really closely at what are the priorities of your research, what are the priorities of your collaborators and the communities that you're working with and for, those issues can then be like navigated a little bit more carefully or with less anxiety. I'm like very anxious about like this tension between having things open, but also protecting, the subjects of the work, the people who are creators who may be exposed to really harmful things if those documents are made more public. So I think that coming back to the heart of what's important, coming back to that why you're doing the research really helps me at least be firm in my decisions of a yes or no for public access for different aspects of a project. So I know that we're over time, so I will definitely be happy to talk rich prospect browsing with anybody over the the course of the week or over the month, whatever. You're welcome to reach out at any time.
And I will just say first, thank you, Purdom. Every time I hear you speak, I learn more and more. And it's been this hour together has been amazing. Thank you to everyone who has been here today. Thank you for attending our Digital Humanities virtual hour, our first one, our only one of summer 2022. We'll start again in the fall.